Hello, everybody. It's a big pleasure to be with our new audience today. I am very excited of sharing this first video of stories of Portugal. We're very exciting to have Chris Bomgaars. I don't know how to describe Chris because since I met Chris maybe 1 year or two years ago, besides that he has 18 years of experience in the pork industry, Chris, first of all, he will explain more about this, but he was involved in a family-owned pork production. He has an international business degree from a university in the U.S., Loyola. And another thing that really captured my attention about Chris is that you have a lot of experience in Latin America. You have living in Costa Rica. You speak a little bit Spanish. Uh, so I think that personality of yours, being involved in the production, then having a college degree education and having experience in Latin America. And now Chris will explain a little bit later about his baby, Everypigh, that he's the founder and entrepreneur and CEO. So I think that this is going to be a big value. And thank you, Chris, for your time and be open to share your thoughts and to be here with us.
Well,
How
thanks for
are
that
you?
introduction. I'm doing great. Thanks for that generous introduction and having me on. And congratulations on the launch of the podcast. I think it's going to be a lot of fun today, and I think the industry is going to get a lot of value out of what you're doing and sharing of your expertise and your network. So thanks for having me.
So I think that my introduction doesn't make an honor all your story. Why don't you, Chris, start for explaining to our audience your background and how you get into your last entrepreneurship with Everypig?
Yeah, so I grew up in a town of about 6,000 people in northwest Iowa called Orange City. There were probably about 1 million pigs in the county at the time and maybe 35,000 people. So you can basically throw a rock anywhere in Sioux County and hit a hog confinement. And so just a lot of animals around. My dad started the Orange City Veterinary Clinic. So he's a veterinarian and started a mixed animal practice, so small animal and large animal. So he had, always had really close ties to the community through that. And yeah, so I grew up in town, but was kind of raised a little bit like a farm kid since my dad was a farmer growing up and my grandparents lived on a farm and had uncles on the farm. So a lot of tasks like vaccinating pigs, preg checking cows, sweeping out pits of new hog barns when they were going up, printing off labels that went on the medication back in the day when you actually almost had to know how to code in order to get something done on a computer. So really, I guess had a pretty deep background since a young age. Despite growing up in town of doing a lot of things on the farm and all that kind of led to what I've been doing here for the last 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, I think, Chris, that that's a lot of value because I know that we will talk about later about Everypig, but I think that that first, let's say, experience of your career, let's put it in that way, provide you the real sense of being in the field. Because sometimes we face so many people in the industry that maybe barely have been in a farm or barely know the really, let's say, process or the dynamics that's going being inside a farm. And that's part of our philosophy in a port school is trying to get education and trying to get in contact with the people that really is involved with the animals.
Yeah, and I look full transparency. I can't tell you that I'm in barns all that often. I try get in a couple of times a year when I'm back in Iowa. But I think having that experience growing up and having people really close in my network who are in the barns has been incredibly helpful. Both in my former career with the family business and pork production, and especially now, I would say as we're continuing to build software and just having a really tight feedback loop with the people that are in the barns has been really invaluable to the development of Everypigh.
Yeah, and I think that from the time that you were involved, in those days in the farms from today, where we have all these AI booming experience, is a big difference. Basically, what you're doing with every pig, but it's a massive difference how you digest numbers, how you manage information from then to now, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess kind of getting back to the topic about being in the barns, I think there's room for everyone in this industry right now, whether people are in barns or aren't in barns. It seems to be more and more important that you at least have the communication with the people in the barns, an open line of communication, because we're seeing over the course of the last 5 to 10 years an increasing amount of jobs go remote. And I think tools, new technologies are going to enable more and more people to actually work inside of our industry that maybe aren't in those barns on a day-to-day basis or maybe even a weekly basis. But these technologies are going to be increasingly valuable for helping them understand what's going on inside of the barns. And that's the main thing. It's the getting the insights, and then maybe having the perspective. Being outside the barns can help give a little bit more perspective, and having more experience with a larger number of farms can give you that perspective to maybe make some shifts and understand, well, this has been working in some other areas and maybe not these areas, and actually applying changes inside the barn. So I think it's going to be an increasingly important collaboration between people inside and outside the barns, and technology is really going to help us with that.
Yeah, I think that there are two major subjects that I would like to go back with your experience that you have being hands-on in the bars, and now what you're providing to the industry, because I think that you know that our platforms here, they are educational focus, but I think that we have some homework to do with the education. And then another subject that you and I discussed maybe last week or 2 weeks ago that we were having another conversation is the Latin force in the USA, not in Mexico, Honduras, Costa
Yeah.
Rica, that maybe we lost focus that in the people that is running the farms in the US, most of them also they are Latin, and maybe sometimes communication skills they are not there. Maybe they barely speak English, so that's another big subject, right?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think it's something that really gets overlooked in our industry right now. Anecdotally, when I started working in the family business that my dad started, this was maybe back in 2000, around 2008. When you would look at our network that we were working with, almost all of the caregivers had Dutch, German, Scandinavian last names. And when you fast forward to today, and we get a lot of insight into a lot of different companies in the industry through Everypigh, I'd say the vast majority of caregivers across the Midwest now have Latin last names. And that has been a major shift that you just don't hear people talking about enough. And with that has come a number of different cultural and language challenges, because most of the managers, most of the owners that I'm aware of don't really speak Spanish, or very little and limited
Wow.
Spanish. And as you mentioned, a lot of the caregivers maybe speak and now you're seeing a shift here into managerial positions for some of these people as well. But a lot of them may not speak English that well. And so there's a major communications gap that's gone on in the industry. And one story that I think about, I was on a friend's farm. I was back home in Iowa for Christmas. And I was riding around with a childhood friend of mine in the tractor, and he's a very successful farmer, owns a lot of land, a couple of hog barns and cattle. And we were driving by one of the hog barns, and there was someone standing outside the hog barn, and I asked my friend who that was, and he said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I think that's the caregiver." And you might think, well, how can a barn
Wow.
owner not know who the caregiver is? Well, a lot of times in our industry now, the barn owner may have an agreement with, let's say, a feed mill, and the feed mill has the contract, and maybe they take care of the labor. So there are a lot of disconnects in the industry that people don't know about. And so I asked him a little bit about the caregiver. I said, "Well, who is he?" And he really didn't know much. He said, "Actually, I've never spoken with him." And they said, "Pull over the tractor, let's get out." And he said, "I don't think he speaks English." And so I said, "Well, pull over the tractor, let's get out. Let's talk to him." And he said, "Yeah, because I'd really like to tell him." The barn was empty at the time, and it was winter time in Northwest Iowa. So obviously, to save on propane, the barn temperatures were kept pretty cool because there were no animals in the barn. But he said, we're getting animals in a few days, and I would like to tell him to turn up the barn temperature a couple degrees each day. And I said, that's it. Let's get out. I'm going to talk to him. So we stopped the tractor. We got out, and I introduced myself in Spanish and introduced my friend. And the smile on this guy's face was from ear to ear, just because
Wow.
we had got out and we were speaking to him. I was speaking to him in his native language, and no one had talked to him that was associated with the barn either in a long time, or he certainly didn't know the barn owner at the time. And he was just so happy that he was being seen and heard and communicated with. And then I gave him the instructions about turning that barn temperature up a couple of degrees so the barn could warm up before the small pigs came in. And it really just stuck with me, because if that was just one isolated incident, think about how many times that's happening in these companies on a day-to-day basis. And I keep going back to technology because that's what I'm focused on, and it's a lot easier to learn how to use an application than it is to learn a foreign language. But I think there's a real opportunity to sort of bridge that communications gap, and I know you're doing that, being bilingual as well. And I think it's just an incredible opportunity for our industry right now to bring people together, when a lot of times there might be little to no communication happening between these stakeholders on a day-to-day basis.
I think, Chris, that you touch a really important, let's say, subject for us, and let's say for me. You use the word being seen. I had the experience to be working in China. I spent 3 years and a half. And when we were trying to to learn Chinese, that I did a really bad job, by the way, in my time in China, they were saying it's not just learning the grammar or how you put the words together, is the feeling, is the intention, how
Yeah.
you how what you want to transmit. So that word that you use, being seen, and when you have a cultural and language barrier, is very important. If we want that the stakeholders or the holders, the people that work at the farms, they engage and they do like a nice job, they need to be in sync. They need to be recognized, not just because we speak Spanish, but also that the owner or a higher, let's say, level people is showing care about their job and acknowledge what they're doing. So it's not just the technology, is how we relate with like human beings, and is part of our industry.
Absolutely. And, back in my time in the family business, I was in charge of business development and growth for the company. And I had the opportunity to work directly and indirectly with thousands of caregivers over those 10 years. And whether they're native Spanish speakers or native English speakers, being seen and being heard is something that is really overlooked in our industry. And that's been one of the most rewarding parts of Everypigh is, since we do things like digitizing digital health records, paper barn sheets, essentially, right? When caregivers get some sort of engagement and acknowledgement from veterinarians and production managers, whether it's even a thumbs up and a thank you for taking care of a problem, or asking for feedback on, is the medication that they're on being effective? Are the pigs moving in the right direction? The engagement levels that we see from caregivers when they're being acknowledged in a timely manner by veterinarians or production managers, it's absolutely incredible. And that was part of really what helped me start Everypigh in the beginning. Is as we grew, we recognized, hey, we weren't always responding to the messages that we were getting from the boots on the ground fast enough. And people, as fast as they can get turned on and get engaged, they can disengage as well. So I think, some of the unseen things that are going on the farm, well, maybe if a caregiver feels like they've been doing all the work, but no one's listening to them, then
Completely agree.
maybe they stop doing the work. But some of the things we see inside the platform are, you know, a lot of caregivers are willing to go the extra mile as long as they feel like it's getting recognized. And that might mean, let's say, posting a pig, for example. You know, that's something when you look back at, you know, my childhood driving around the countryside with my dad when he was strictly a veterinarian. You know, a big part of their job was driving as fast as they could from farm to farm as a veterinarian, posting pigs and then prescribing medications. Well, there are only so many pigs that, you know, veterinarians can drive to and post each day. But when you're using tools and you're responding and giving that feedback, you can turn your caregivers into real assets for your company. And from what I've seen, a lot of these caregivers are willing to post a pig, upload some photos that a veterinarian can take a look at, and they can make treatment decisions
Uh,
based on that. Or they can make a decision, hey, you know what, someone actually needs to go out to this farm because we need to get a little more context. So it's not about replacing farm visits necessarily, but it's about helping companies turn their caregivers into more valuable assets. And in the end, people and the pigs win from that.
yeah, completely agree, Chris. So tell me, because how I start this conversation, your profile is very diverse, because from being born in a pork farm environment, then you decide to go to Costa Rica, to Central America. Where this passion come from? What was your passion to go down there and explore a new culture?
That's a good question. You know, Orange City, Iowa, when I was growing up, was not a very diverse town, as you would imagine, right? It's got a lot of pride in their Dutch heritage. And as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be friends with the foreign exchange students, with anyone that looked different than or spoke differently, because I just felt like I could learn from those people. And so, I guess having a window into different cultures has been something that I've always been interested in. I had an opportunity my sophomore year in college to study abroad. And I was studying, I wanted to study international business at the time, and I thought my Spanish was pretty good. And so I went and I studied in Spain. I thought that was going to be a semester. I fell in love with Spain and I stayed all year. And that turned out to be one of the most important years of my life. And so after college, when I graduated, I was working with a family owned company in New Orleans, not my family's, but it was a family owned business in New Orleans. And they were going to open and expand operations in Central America. And I, you know, immediately stuck my hand up and said, "Hey, this is right up my alley. So give me an opportunity." And you know, it was a great experience. Really learned a lot. Learned a lot about invisible barriers to entry in Latin America. You know, things that they don't teach you in school necessarily. But I guess I've always had kind of that interest for the international flair, and always try to kind of bring lessons learned from different experiences and different friends from other places and into my current position, and really happy to be doing that with Everypig right now. We've got 9 different language versions, and it's really cool to be able to see people with different languages starting to communicate a lot more seamlessly.
Yeah, I think that well, I think for a couple of years, maybe in the last decade, I think traveling has been more easier. That
Yeah.
like my dad, that going to Europe or going to Asia was a completely adventure trip, but now it's very easy. I think that the word is an envelope, but I think that part of our philosophy in port school is to create connections that where two people can get together and create something new. But I think that in these days, the possibility to do that with different culture is very high, with different, even with different mentality, and that's some mastery. Maybe we don't think together, we're not from the same culture, but in some point we can get together and create something new. I think that you need to have a different set of mind. And I think that that experience that you have from a young age, being exposed to different Latin cultures, also is part of your baby or every pig.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's always been a real passion of mine to be able to kind of bridge these gaps because, the story I told earlier about getting out of the tractor and getting down and having a conversation with the Spanish speaking caregiver. Well, that's not, I guess a word we use in the software industry is scalable, right? That's not very scalable. Not everyone's going to learn Spanish, and you can't necessarily have one on one communications all the time. But something that is scalable is technology, right? And it's being able to release multiple language versions, having Google Translate inside the app, to start to really bring these people together. So I think you guys are definitely onto something really important there. It's a huge need in the industry, education, and that goes both ways, right? One of the opportunities that I've had since starting Everypigh is to start to work inside of with companies abroad. And when you start to look at other industries, other countries, and how they're producing pigs, let's take Brazil for example. Brazil has some really interesting natural advantages to their isolation, and so some of their disease burden's a lot lower. But Brazil has absolutely incredible pig performance numbers, and it's pretty easy, I think, for us to be American centric in the industry and think that we're always the best at everything we're doing, and that's certainly not the case. And I think in this day and age, we have a lot more of an opportunity than ever before to look at the best practices from all over the world. Maybe leave some of the things that won't serve you or won't
Yeah.
necessarily enhance what we're doing, but pick up from each one of those countries. Pick up a little something that we can apply to make ourselves competitive and sustainable in the future.
Yeah, completely agree. Going back to the comment that you did about technology, you just went maybe a few weeks ago to a meeting in San Francisco, veterinarian meeting, and you did a really interesting post going back, and you mentioned in your post that AI isn't science fiction anymore. What that means?
Yeah, so full disclosure on that one, I was not allowed into the AASV meeting because I'm not a veterinarian and we didn't sponsor this year. But I was in San Francisco, and I was meeting with a lot of veterinarians that were there. And it's been interesting because having a dad who's a veterinarian, I grew up around veterinarians constantly and have always held the profession in a really high regard. And when I started off on the Everypig journey, some of the first functionalities we did revolved around creating artificial intelligence. And if I could go back in time, I probably wouldn't have started with some of those things. It was probably a little early. But I remember some of the early conversations, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago already, when I would mention AI in our industry, that was still artificial insemination. That wasn't even artificial intelligence AI.
Yeah.
And I can think back to one of the early conversations I had with a production manager at a very large production company. And after I had shown him a little bit of Everypigh, he looked at me and he kind of had this blank stare on his face. And he said, Chris, I feel like I'm here in the field plowing by hand, and you just walked up with a shiny new tractor, and I'm afraid to get in. And
Wow.
I thought that at the time I had to think about what that meant. And I was kind of frustrated because I thought, this is going to be common sense and second nature to everybody. But there was a really valuable lesson in that. And I think it's kind of about meeting people and meeting the industry where they're at. And one of the lessons getting back to AASV in San Francisco this year, I heard a lot of comments about this meeting being in California, San Francisco specifically. And I think a lot of that
Hmm.
was because of the political environment, and maybe because of some undertones of, well, it's the city slickers versus the farmers, because of some of the
Hmm.
regulations that had gone in place coming out of California. And looking back on it now, I think it might have been a really good place to have the conversation, because the consumers aren't that we're focusing on messaging to, or should be focusing on, they're not in a small town in Iowa. They're not in a small town in Nebraska. You don't need to convince those people to buy bacon and to buy pork. What we do need to do is convince the population centers on the coasts and educate the population centers. And so I think that was maybe one of the positive aspects of having AASV in California this year. Secondly, going to and from the airport in San Francisco, I counted at least a half a dozen billboards that were specifically focused on artificial intelligence. These were AI companies explaining AI off the freeway in California that these veterinarians couldn't ignore. Secondly, a lot of veterinarians, including some that I was with, were taking Waymo cars, which were driverless cars, to and
That's
from
scary. That's scary.
we were taking these driverless Waymo cars to and from dinners and things like that around San Francisco. And it was so cool because a couple of the veterinarians that I was with, initially I hadn't been in one myself either. And initially we were a little bit afraid. But I'll tell you what, after sitting in one of those cars, I'd rather have a Waymo driver, which is an algorithm, versus most of the Uber and Lyft drivers that I have on a daily basis. And the veterinarians told me they were very comfortable with it as well. And so I think that's all part of, starting to see AI going mainstream and actually impacting our lives. But AASV this year had a whole seminar dedicated to artificial intelligence. And, going back to when I started talking to the industry about this 7, 8 years ago, you would oftentimes get a blank look on your face, like you were telling people there were aliens in the room with you or something completely crazy. And I think AI has been normalized to the point now where the conversation's really about, well, how do we harness this inside of our industry in order to give us valuable insights that we can take action on? And it has really become much more mainstream, normalized conversation rapidly in the last I would say 2 to 3 years. And so that was something that was really satisfying to see. And it's only going to accelerate. We're only going to see applications of artificial intelligence be more and more useful in our industry, as we are in basically all industries.
Wow, that's very, I think that from the old school veterinarians that you're talking about, it captured my attention to another subject that you mentioned in your post, that is a generational shift. So that is happening very fast. That maybe 5, 10 years ago changes were more steady, but now is everything is changing so rapidly. So how do
Yeah.
you think that shift of generation?
Well,
That
I
going
think,
into the pork production, right? Into the pork
yeah,
production, huh?
yeah. I can tell you, I remember when my sister came on board in our family business. I think it was maybe around 5 years after I had joined, and she was the first female in a lot of the meetings that the only female that we were having in a lot of the
Wow, that's a good
leadership
point. Wow.
meetings we were having. And I remember feeling pretty protective. Not that my sister needs any protecting; she is definitely able to defend herself quite well if ever needed.
She
But I
will hear
remember,
this, so she will hear this, so be careful.
yeah, she'll like to hear that if she does listen. Um, but there just weren't that many females involved in the industry at all, much less in leadership positions 5 or 10 years ago. And when you fast forward to today, I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but I think it might be somewhere around 70 to 80% of veterinarians graduating from most vet schools. And I think this also applies to even large animal schools are female now. And so there is a major gender shift that is happening and it's already happened in our industry. And if you don't think that's going to change some things about the way the industry operates, I think you're sorely mistaken. And one of the, I guess, interesting things from a technology perspective is that from what I'm seeing, a lot of times the new entrants into the industry aren't as married to the old practices and processes as people that have been in it a long time. And you had mentioned this seems to be happening faster and faster. I think it's only going to accelerate because now you have conversations happening around things like quality of life. And back in the day, my dad's generation, that was nothing anyone would ever talk about. I'm talking even in private conversations. much less a podcast or a blog.
Hmm.
None of these veterinarians I can think of growing up would ever have a conversation about quality of life. It was much more of a badge of honor if you were working 80 hours a week in your 40s and 50s and 60s. And this generation of veterinarian now wants to have a quality of life. They want to be increasingly at their kids' ball games. They want to be involved in their children's
Agree.
lives more and more. And they're going to have to be able to work remotely and to add value to their customers and to the pigs that they have under their care,
That's a
working
good point. Yeah.
working remotely. And you combine that with the rural veterinary shortage that we all know is a major problem, recruiting to some of these small towns, no matter how nice they are, it's been a challenge for decades to recruit and retain veterinarians to work in a lot of these small towns. And if on top of that, you're expecting them to work 80 hours a week, year after year after year on end, you're going to end up not having any veterinarians working for you. And so I think this is a real opportunity for technology again to help address that work life balance while even doing a better job staying in touch with your caregivers and better servicing quicker response times for your animals because the quality of life conversation isn't going away.
Yeah, I have a 2 points here. I, I read this comment that you say, this statement really opened my mind that when you were saying also in that conversation, the quality of life reshaping is how everybody we measure quality of life, but we need to keep engaged in our operation, what we call work or job, and then also education, because we need to keep learning, we need to keep updated, we need to find ways of put information in our hands, and the way to do it is with all these AI tools and remote communication. You are right now in Florida, I'm here in Texas. So all this beauty that we have, we need to use it in the proper way. And we know that our main subject is producing pork, meat, animal protein, feed this world. So that's really, really interesting how this is reshaping our society and the way that we produce this protein, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And speaking of kind of that topic on the remote work, so I moved to Florida in 2008 pretty shortly after realizing that my main job was finding pigs and finding barns and negotiating contracts to put these pigs in, right? And I was doing everything over the phone. And pretty soon on, I thought to myself, well, if I can do that, why can't I live where I want to live? And so I was buying pigs and finding sites in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota sometimes, all remotely since 2008. And I remember the pushback that I would get from a lot of people when I'd go to an industry event and would go, well, how can you buy pigs? How can you buy pigs when you're in Florida? I just pull out my cell phone. You want to see me buy 10,000 pigs right now? Here's 2 text messages, you know? And so I think that's something that, boots on the ground matter, but don't underestimate what can be done remotely and also how fast you can do it. I think looking back at my former career with the family business where all day I was just having to fill barns and buy pigs to fill those barns. If you don't have the responsibilities of going out and planting a field, and you don't have to look at the pigs yourself, and you don't have all these other tasks, and you can stay focused on one task, and it's you and your cell phone, there is an incredible amount you can get done. I mean, I remember a lot of times I would have most of the pigs that were available in the spot market bought by the end of the day before some of my competitors even looked at their phone and could start to make a phone call. And so I think when you think about the importance of speed for animal health and welfare, just think about how quickly a lot of these diseases spread and what the difference between responding to a hemolytic E. coli outbreak on day one, or maybe even in hour 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, versus looking at historical mortality reports on an Excel sheet that tell you about the pigs that died 3 months ago. and that's what a lot of our industry is still used to. And so I love talking about artificial intelligence, but if you want to back up really and meet the industry where they're at today, 95% of the pork producers still don't have their paper barn sheets digitized. And I think we really need to start to focus on having a conversation on the power of having real time digitized information, like symptomatic animals, like treatments that are going into these animals, water consumption on a daily basis at your fingertips, instead of looking in the rear view mirror at historical mortality reports when there's nothing you can do about those things.
Oh, Chris, we can say that your initial background in the farms, your education, your exposure to different cultures, your curiosity, and the way that you see things is the base of Everypigh.
Yeah, I never really thought I was going to get into agriculture when I was younger, and I kind of resented having to do some of those jobs on the farm when I didn't grow up on the farm. But looking back on it now, all those things definitely led to where I'm at today. And I think during our time or my time at the family business, when we were expanding operations a lot, just an honest look at what we were doing that was working and what wasn't working, and probably having some of these, mortality issues where we didn't do a great job of responding to our caregivers on the ground or the managers on the ground when it was really on us. Definitely helped me start Everypigh, because that was something that tugged at my conscience and at our pocketbooks, right? We always wanted to do the best job we could raising these animals. We have a responsibility to do so, and that happens to align with financial incentives as well. The more pig lives you can save, the more money you're saving. And so I think it was kind of a long, windy road to this point in my career, but just really fortunate for all those experiences.
Well, Chris, we have a little couple minutes more. So, can you explain to our pork audience what is Everypigh and what's your main vision and what's your passion about this?
Yeah, so Everypig is an application. It's really just a sophisticated website. So users are logging onto their phone or tablets or home computers, getting on the site, and the core functionality is digitizing these paper barn sheets and adding much more. So caregivers are completing digital daily checkups in Everypig, telling us about any movements on or off the farm, symptoms of the animals if they're showing any. We're collecting things like water consumption, temperatures in the barn, so environmental data, treatments, mortalities, photos and videos, and we're packaging that up and presenting that information. If there's anything that crosses a threshold or anything that's important that's been reported there, we'll give notifications to production managers and veterinarians. So instead of just getting a text message, a veterinarian maybe he's driving down the road and they get a message of a text with a post-mortem of a pig. Well, that's great, but they still have probably 20 more questions that they might have around that specific group of pigs. And so we try package all that up in Everypigh with a bunch of context around the pig group as well. So within a couple of clicks, a veterinarian can see, what the trend lines are for that group. Are they having a mortality issue? Have they been treating the pigs with proper medications? Are they dosing properly? Is there a water consumption issue? And that's part of the IoT component, the Internet of Things component of Everypigh as well. Is we do connect with other software and hardware systems. Barn Tools, for example, is one of those hardware systems that we connect to at Everypigh, so we can automatically pull in for a lot of our users. We are automatically pulling in water consumption and barn temperature data to help reduce the amount of time caregivers need to spend putting information in the app. But our focus is on improving animal health and welfare and outcomes for our customers and for the pigs. And we're really doing that through digitizing and centralizing a lot of the information and communications that are going on inside of these pork production companies.
So, do you think, Chris, that this is the right time to the industry to go into these platforms? Uh, Adding a little bit what we were discussing before, this generational change, or do you think still a little bit of resistance of these tools?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I do feel pretty good about the timing right now. I started this journey maybe ideation to today almost a decade ago, maybe 9 years ago,
Wow.
and really thought that I had nailed the timing on this thing. And it turns out the industry really needed a little more time, probably before they were ready for something like an Everypig. But we are gaining a lot of traction. We've added a lot of veterinary users and a lot of companies to the platform in the last 12 months. And a lot of the topics that we've discussed already, remote work, really being able to recognize and respond to pig health challenges quick enough and better service the people on the farm. These are all things that are increasingly important. And artificial intelligence is definitely being normalized as we discussed. So, yeah, I feel pretty good about the timing. I think we're getting a lot closer to it. But there's a lot of room for growth right now. And as I mentioned earlier, I would say probably at least 95% of US pork producers don't have really digitized um, daily checkups or digitized barn sheets yet. So most companies are still relying on pieces of paper that get maybe faxed or mailed into an office once a week or once a month. And they really don't have that structured data packaged in a way where they can see these things in real time and actually respond to them in real time. So I think there's a ton of room for growth, a lot of opportunity, but the conversation and the adoption is picking up really quickly.
So, Chris, I just want to say the date because maybe this video is gonna be accessible maybe in a, a couple years, a few years in advance. So today is April 2nd, 2025. We have a challenge in tariffs, disease, so political. So what do you think are the challenge for the pork industry? Sometimes I ask 5 years, but right now
Wow.
I think it's in the next 6 months or in the next
Yeah.
year because
Yeah.
right now everything is going so fast, but the precisely events that we're experiencing today, April 2nd, 2025, they are unique in our history. But I think that all what is happening will affect in some point migration. We were talking about in the beginning visas or people going back home. That will affect the production, the people that are working in the US, tariffs, disease, fear. So it's a lot of things going on. How do you make this blend? Let's say the main challenge of the pork production in the next 6 months, 1 year.
I love the question, and there is a lot in there. We could probably do a whole nother podcast just kind of forecasting things out. So first I want to say the pork producers that are left in the United States are incredibly resilient. They are
It's a good thing.
survivors that have seen volatility that most people cannot comprehend. Most pork producers have been close to being broke more than once in their careers, seen a ton of equity wiped off the table, had years where they made a lot of money. So I would say, first and foremost, volatility is something that producers are definitely used to. Now, you mentioned a lot of uncertainties around tariffs. In the family business, they still procure a lot of pigs out of Canada. I'm very familiar with buying pigs out of Canada, and I know they've been able to come to agreements with a lot of their suppliers and brokers on sort of sharing those increased costs of tariffs. I can't help but think if the tariffs are in place with Canada for a while, you're probably going to see the price of ISO wings and feeder pigs, if there still are many feeder pigs being sold out of Canada, brought into the US, probably come down to some extent. But we'll see what happens with those tariffs. I don't claim to have a clue what's going to go on there, but I just wanted to mention, there are a lot of very resilient. The people that are left are very resilient and able to work through quite a few challenges. One of the things forecasting a few years out that I'll go on record saying is, it might sound crazy today, but I think you're going to see robots playing a major role in the future of caregiving of animals. Whether those robots are initially controlled by humans, maybe that are remote, and or using a combination of sensors and algorithms to start to be able to execute on some of those daily tasks. I think in 5 or 10 years, we'll probably look back and be surprised at how much manual labor was going into taking care of animals versus what's actually in happening in 5 to 10 years. On the robotics front, some of these robots coming out of China already, I think, are maybe around 15 or 20,000. Seems like kind of that $20,000, $30,000 price points. What some of the U.S. robotics companies are talking about wanting to get the robots down to. And there's going to be a certain point where maybe it starts with one simple task, and then it eventually morphs into them being able to do more and more. But I think we're going to see robots playing a much larger role than most people are talking about right now here in the not so distant future. Um, in terms of AI, software is a lot faster than hardware. The iterations, if you just look at ChatGPT and Gemini and the DeepSeek model, out of China, rolling out improved AI models seems to be something that's really fast. And so if you're collecting the data, plugging that data into either your own algorithms and or off the shelf solutions, I think is going to be something that is much more commonly accepted. Now, creating the data collection platforms that are collecting data points that are really useful to the algorithms and then ultimately useful to you as a producer is going to be, that's still somewhat complicated. So I think you're going to see algorithms making a lot of the decisions in terms of nutrition, maybe even treatment decisions once we're able to start to collect more and more data from sensors. The sensor, I can see really full stack sensor arrays, including audio, visual, listening for coughs, things like that. And there are companies that are approaching this already. They're still pretty expensive, and as you know, there's a little bit of a misalignment in incentives between maybe the pig owner and the barn owner that oftentimes are not the same entity. So the pig owner wants the data more than the barn owner in a lot of cases. And the pig owner may not want to invest in these expensive hardware solutions that are going into barns that they don't own. As we see the price of hardware come down, I think we're going to see more and more sensor arrays being placed in these barns. The sensors are going to be feeding the algorithms. The algorithms are going to
Wow.
be making suggestions that are more and more useful. And they're going to be much more predictive, more proactive versus reactive. One of the AI services we have in Everypigh is a machine learning algorithm that's used millions of digitized barn sheets and APIs that's pulling in data, and it finds correlations in the daily checkups with mortality events in the future. And we're already helping veterinarians to identify groups of pigs that are likely to have mortality events in the near future with about 70 to 75% accuracy. Those numbers are only going to go up the more useful data we can feed it and the smarter that these AI models become. So I would say we're going to get much more proactive and predictive versus responsive. So looking at historical mortality reports, again, it's going to be something that's much more in the past, and we're going to start to be looking a long ways forward into the future when we're thinking about making decisions. So I think people and pigs are going to both win in that front.
Maybe we can say that that's the dream of every pig, to be adding that value to the industry in the next years.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely part of our mission. It's part of what we've been working on for years now, and we're starting to be able to help producers do that and veterinarians do that now. But it's definitely going to take a lot more work in the future, more and more sensors, better structured data. But these algorithms are only going to get smarter.
And I may think that you want to do all this surfing in Costa Rica.
It's been a while since I've surfed, but that sounds like a nice vision. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just because all this value, obviously, I'm just joking around, because when we were talking before about the quality of life and how to add value to the industry, and at the same time doing things remotely, um, let's say, living this life in a different way and getting connectivity. I think it's possible. In some ways, is doable. And I think what you should explain is a good vision, not just of every peak, but I think part of what we are doing in Port School is growing a community that we can put our individuality and our value together to go in the same direction. But we have, like you say, we can talk hours about the challenges that we have right now: diseases, exports, tariffs, politics, productions. That that we need to open this space, Chris, to talk, open conversations, and to be more attentive what is going on and get together. It doesn't matter your culture, if you speak one language or another, but we need to, let's say, do things differently. And I think it's fast. Is we need to do this fast, Chris. That's what I think.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I think you're a great example of living that balance and keeping that energy. Things aren't very sustainable if we're dying of a heart attack at 45 years old, right? Or, maybe a more common scenario is just not feeling good on a day-to-day basis because we're not getting out and getting a little bit of vitamin D or getting our walk or our workout in. And if we want to talk about sustainability in the industry, I think we need to talk about personal sustainability and take a look at what that
Wow,
means. So,
that's another subject that I like that. And we're working in a program. I don't want to disclose that now, but we're working in a program in Spanish. I did a podcast in poultry school with a guy from Brazil, from Cargill. I can say his name, Mario Pence, and he was saying we need to take care of who takes care of the animals.
yeah.
If we don't take care of us and the people that work with us, it's impossible that we can do a good job taking care of the animals and providing that protein to the world that is very necessary. So, amigo Chris, thank you very much for the time. Thank you very much for your ideas, and let's keep pushing in the same way, and let's do this.
Well, I really love what you're doing here and wish you all the best success and hope to be on again at another time, maybe for your 100th podcast down the road. But really have a lot of respect for what you're doing and wish you all the best with it.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the people that is going to be watching this, in the post that we're going to be sharing this, you will find Chris tag and Chris information if you want to get in contact with him. And thank you very much, guys, the people that is hearing us and trusting us. And Chris, thank you very much and see you around. Thank you, amigo. Bye-bye.
Gracias, Rodolfo.
Bye.